Dr. David Blight, who is a top scholar on the 14th Amendment, Reconstruction, and of course, Frederick Douglass. He's here today to help talk a little bit about, I thought it would be really beneficial to have a little bit of a symposium on the 14th Amendment being such an important amendment that we're all impacted by on a regular basis. So please give your best attention and alertness to Dr. David Blight.
You haven't heard anything yet. What are you clapping for? Am I on the mic? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the front? Oh, good. Good morning. Good. It's a great pleasure to be here at Wright Tech. I've had a wonderful tour. What an amazing school you all go to. Let's imagine a time when your country has just been through a massive civil war. Not a pleasant thing to imagine. There's been all kinds of talk in the last few years, in the press, on podcasts, and every other way we communicate, asking whether the United States is on the brink of some kind of new, if not civil war, civil conflict over all the political division we have, all our polarization. Did you wake up today polarized? Are you aware that you're polarized? What does that mean? What does it mean that we're polarized? Well, think on it. But let's imagine the United States has just experienced a massive civil war that killed about 700,000 people. Per capita, that number of people who died in the American Civil War, if you move it to today, to our population now, the United States 1960s, move it to today when we have 335 odd million people, that means about 5 to 5.5 million Americans would have just died in a civil war. Now, you don't want to live in that moment. We don't even really want to imagine it. But let's imagine that the United States has done this once before. It did. Now, that war was by and large, if not entirely, caused by the system of racial slavery. You know this from taking history classes, although you can still get up a debate in this country as to just how much slavery caused the Civil War. But slavery was the essential cause of the war. Emancipation was the essential result of that war that came out of a massive total war between the largest armies ever assembled on planet Earth. Since slavery was destroyed, mostly, the people in charge of that war, on the Union side, the northern side, the side of the United States, were responsible now, willingly in most cases, but they were responsible for figuring out, oh my God, what do we do now? The American Union was torn to pieces. 11 states had seceded from the Union, had fought this all-out war. The devastation of life and treasure was far greater in the South than in the North by any comparison. Racial slavery was outlawed in the 13th Amendment, passed in late January 1865, ratified December 1865. That 13th Amendment is very, very simple, as probably you know from having looked at it. It just says involuntary servitude of any kind is therefore and forever abolished. except for imprisonment for crime. The 13th Amendment is so simple in its language, but the only way the United States got to that 13th Amendment, they've been told before the first 10 of the Bill of Rights, as you may know, all those rights we talk about when we're fighting over free speech, or freedom of religion and all the other elements of the Bill of Rights. There had only been 2 more amendments before the Civil War. Now there are going to be 3 really big ones in the wake of this huge event. Without the emancipation of 4 million slaves, there is no 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery forever in the United States. Without the emancipation of 4 million slaves, there is no 14th Amendment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And without emancipation, there is no 15th Amendment, which is the Voting Rights Amendment. All 3 of these amendments passed Congress within 2 years, 3 years, and were ratified within 4 years. It is, without question, the remaking of the United States Constitution out of that Civil War, and it was a second founding of the United States. And most important of all are a few key clauses of that 14th Amendment. Now, you don't wake up every day thinking about this. 99% of Americans don't wake up thinking about this every day unless you become a lawyer, because 2/3 of all litigation in American courts as we speak is 14th Amendment litigation. I could come back to that if you want me to try to explain. But the most important clauses in that remaking of the country, remaking of the Constitution, and its second founding as a republic is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. Now, probably you don't, I'm sure you don't, remember a man named Khizr Khan. Anybody remember that name? Probably not. Khizr Khan was born in Pakistan. He emigrated to the United States. He got a law degree in the United States. He was a practicing lawyer. His son was killed in Iraq as an American soldier. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And by various means, the Democratic Party at its national convention in 2016 asked Khizr Khan, immigrant, lawyer, Gold Star father, son died in Iraq, to speak. And if you ever want to, go to YouTube sometime. Dial up the 2016 Democratic National Convention and dial up Khizr Khan, K-A-H-N, and watch his speech. He, among other things, talked about the meaning of the country to him, the death of his son. He especially talked about the Constitution and the 14th Amendment. A year or so later, he was being interviewed on National Public Radio, late afternoon, by one of the correspondents on All Things Considered, if you ever listen to NPR. And the woman interviewing him took him through, it was a significant, lengthy interview for NPR. And she asked him, what does this country mean to you? And it never means quite as much as it does to immigrants, and I bet some of you understand that in your own families. He then began to talk about his son. I remember this interview because I was in my car. And I think I just arrived home, but I left the car in the driveway and I listened to the whole interview. NPR is always glad to hear that when they hear you do that. And finally, Khan was asked about the Constitution. Sir, what does the Constitution mean to you? How do you use the Constitution in your life, in your legal practice, and so on? And then she finally asked him, what's your favorite part of the Constitution? He said, well, that's easy. It's Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And then he began to say, and she said, would you like to recite it? He said, I'm not sure I can. I'll lose my composure. I'm afraid I will cry, and he did. And that NPR correspondent on the radio was audibly weeping, you could hear it, as this man verbatim quoted Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which reads, as dull as it may sound, this is the umbrella of the U.S. Constitution that you live under every day, and if you ever lose it, we don't have a country. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. What has that just said? If you are born here, you're a citizen. It's birthright citizenship. The United States had never had that before. The United States had never had a federal definition of what citizenship means. The only definitions of citizenship in the United States for the first 80-some years were vague considerations that people were citizens of their state. You were a citizen of Virginia or of Connecticut, which meant different things in different states, because Americans are obsessed with states' rights. That's the first sentence of the 14th, birthright citizenship, which some political persuasions in the United States in recent years have wanted to take away. And there are a lot of countries in the world that don't have it. The rest of Section 1 reads, and here's where it gets really important. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person, drum roll, within its jurisdiction, thank you, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Now, what did all that just say? It says, if you're a citizen, and the first sentence just said you are if you're born here, regardless of race, creed, color, etc., you now cannot be denied all of the privileges and immunities of citizens. All those Bill of Rights, everything in the Bill of Rights. And by the time the 14th Amendment was passed, they had already passed the first Civil Rights Act in American history. I'll come back to that in a second. They passed that in 1866. The 14th will be passed about a month and a half, 2 months after that first Civil Rights Act, which I'll describe in a second. Ratified almost 2 years later by 3/4 of the states. But this second part of the 14th, there are only 2 sentences in this section of the 14th Amendment. But there's sacred language. It may sound legalistic, thereof and therefore, lawyers can't write without those words. But what this is saying is, this is a country now of rights before law. It is a country by the rule of law, and anyone of any creed, color, background, etc., including the former enslaved, previous condition of servitude, as it had said in the 13th Amendment, have all of these rights. And most important, it said no state can make any such law. I put up this man, isn't he handsome? John Bingham. You've known in America, 99 and % of Americans don't know who John Bingham was. John Bingham wrote Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. He was a congressman from Ohio, south central Ohio. He was born all the way back in 1815. He was an evangelical Christian, which in those years meant if you were in the North, they tended to become anti-slavery. He had always been anti-slavery, though not exactly a radical abolitionist before the Civil War. But he got all caught up in that new political party in the 1850s called the Republican Party that will eventually elect Abraham Lincoln. And John Bingham was one among many of these Republicans who had lived now. He entered Congress in the early 1850s. These Republicans, this original Republican Party, frankly, not to be confused with today's Republican Party, because they've done a flip, let's put it that way. Bingham was part of this new anti-slavery, sometimes quite moderately anti-slavery, in some cases fairly radical anti-slavery political party that revolutionized American politics, tore apart the American political party system, and more rapidly than any other political organization in all of our history, elected a president in 6 years. It was born in 1854 over the crisis, over the expansion of slavery into the West, and it's going to elect its candidate to the presidency just 6 years later. You hear a lot now and then, and you will continue to hear it in your lives, of Americans yearning to see our political parties somehow busted up, you know, and maybe we could have a realignment. People want a realignment. Every 4 years, people are wishing for a realignment. Why can't we get a more green party? Why can't we get a more this party and that party? Or why can't we get a more right-wing, far right-wing party? We have one now. But the only time we've ever really had a true, total realignment of our political parties, where they just really changed. The first time, it led to a civil war, 1850s up to 1860. The second time was the Great Depression. That makes me the bearer of bad news. Sorry. You want a big political realignment in America? There's your choice. Would you vote for a civil war or a Great Depression? Of course, neither. You don't want either one of those. You want to avoid those. Keep thinking about that in the coming election year and all the dozens of other election years ahead in your lifetime. But back to the 14th Amendment. John Bingham's arguments, and by the way, they hammered this out in the winter of 1866, spring 1866, in Congress. 11 states, the 11 states of the Confederacy that had seceded from the Union, are not yet back in the Union. They're not there. It's going to make it, in some ways, easier for these Northerners now to pass legislation to reinforce what they've just done. And what have they just done? They've emancipated 4 million people out of slavery into some new status. But what are they going to be? Would American slaves, the day after they're emancipated or the year after they're emancipated, become, in effect, serfs, as in Russia, with no rights, riveted to the land, with some kind of legal relationship with their former owners? Or would they become some kind of higher degree wards of the state? Or would they become genuine citizens with all the same privileges and immunities and human rights as white Southerners who used to own them? That's why sometimes we call the American Civil War and Reconstruction era, in fact, almost every historian does now, it's why we call it sometimes the Second American Revolution. This is a revolution in the definition and meaning of the United States. Now, this wasn't an easy process, to say the least. But when Bingham got up in the Congress, and he was not alone in this, but he was the principal voice, arguing for this Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, this fundamental creation of equality before law. He said, what we really are doing is, and this is worth writing down, just his words, he said, we are federalizing the Bill of Rights. Now, what that meant was, as you may know from your civics education and your history education, and if you've been studying the 14th Amendment, I'm sure your teachers have brought this up. The United States was founded, of course, as a conglomeration of these states. 13 original. They started adding some in the early 19th century. And in our Constitution, the states have lots of power. It's an eternal debate. It's called federalism, the relationship of the federal government to the states. It's an eternal fight in this country. You can't wish it away. It's embedded in the DNA of our Constitution, but it's undergone some changes because of history, and this is one. Bingham is saying, we had that Civil War because a section of this country created and lived by this massive system of slavery, and they defended it in the Constitution by their state's right to their property. And legally that was true, but an all-out civil war had crushed this system and necessitated a new legal regime and definition of who these people were and who their former owners are. Federalize the Bill of Rights, he said, meaning if you are discriminated against in a hotel, on a railroad, in some kind of public access, anywhere in the country, you now, this was revolutionary. If they would enforce it, you can sue in a federal court, not just a state court. What chances do you have in Alabama in 1866? Nothing against Alabama, or Mississippi, or Georgia, and so on. But what chances do you have if you're black to sue in those courts? Once those courts even reorganize, who are the judges going to be? Probably ex-Confederates. So Bingham is saying, and again, he's not alone, this strange-looking guy says, let's federalize the Bill of Rights. Let's put our human rights in the Constitution and enforce them by federal law. Meaning, the national government having control over a great deal of what goes on in local situations. Now, I don't know if you've encountered this in your own lives yet, but Americans are sort of crazy with their jealousy about localism. Don't come into my state and tell us how to handle our water system, our sewage system, our school system, our immigration system, etc. Well, look at our history. How did the modern civil rights movement succeed at all? Well, it came when 3 presidents in a row, including Dwight Eisenhower, who hated having to do this. He was a states' rightist. When 3 presidents in a row, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, sent federal troops into the South to enforce civil rights laws in places like Little Rock, Oxford, Mississippi, and many, many, many other places. A collision none of them wanted, but all of them had to have. The template for understanding not only all that this has to do with race, and the 14th Amendment is all about race, contrary to what our Supreme Court has been recently saying, it is also about the nature of this Constitution that you live under. Are you going to live in a society that says your individual rights in Stamford, Connecticut, in a department store where you are arrested, or with local police, or with any other kind of issue, is that only to be adjudicated in a local court with no access to federal courts or federal power? For these Republicans of the Civil War era, this was almost a bridge too far. No one had ever done this in America, federalizing our rights. But they realized they had just overseen a massive war to destroy a system of racial slavery, and they were responsible now for creating a new situation, a new legal regime, a new constitution. And that 14th Amendment is that new constitution. Back when we had the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment, in 2016, 17. There was a lot of interest in this around the country. There is again, for various reasons, part of which is Mr. Trump's legal problems. You've heard of him. A lot of us were running around at conferences speaking about the 14th Amendment, realizing that most Americans couldn't tell you one thing that's in the 14th Amendment. Now they are getting better at it. But I decided that everybody should have a laminated version of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment in their left pocket. And I started to make my own. And I'd go out and give talks, and I'd say, yeah, we all have our own. And pretty soon I'd arrive somewhere to give a talk, and they'd made their own. This one comes from Sewanee University, a former University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. I went up to speak to the Maine Humanities Council once, and I arrived, and they had their own laminated Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. This is before Khizr Khan had inspired me. And by the way, Khizr Khan, like some other Americans, and especially lawyers, carries a pocket constitution. I do too. I have several of these. This one's getting worn out, but I carry it around. I mean, I don't remember everything that's in this Constitution. I have to look it up. Somebody wants to throw the Eighth Amendment at me, I have to, what the hell is the Eighth Amendment? Or mysteriously, the 17th, 18th, and 19th. What was the 19th Amendment? Voting rights for women. You go, girl. Is that the end of class?
No, it isn't. It's the lunch for...
Oh, lunch. Okay, well, you're not done with me yet. Sorry about that.
Another 25 minutes.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
you're good.
Are they going to do any Q&A?
What?
You want them to do any Q&A?
If you want
I'd
to.
love to. Okay.
Good.
All right, but wait a second. Wait a second. Don't get too antsy. Hey, I used to be a high school teacher. I spent 7 years as a high school teacher. It's been a long time, but I do have some sense of your energy. Sorry? Oh. Back up with me a little bit, though. Think bigger on this. James Baldwin, the great African-American writer, poet, theorist of history, eminently quotable. One of my favorite quotable lines by James Baldwin is, he said, it is easy to make, he used the term men, sorry, it is easy to make men equal before God. It is eminently much more difficult to make men equal before each other. What does he mean? Well, human rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We can say those are God-given rights, right? They're natural rights. We can declare ourselves equal before God and nature. Take your choice. Now, believing in that is another matter, but it's kind of easy to say that. But we're going to be equal with each other. We're going to live equal. We're going to get up every day and try to be equal with each other in a society with enormous inequality. Class inequality, racial inequality, status inequality, access inequality. And we have a lot of it. But Baldwin had a point. Our job down here on earth is to round up those fabulous God-given ideas of life and liberty, property, pursuits of happiness, popular sovereignty, which means a right to representation in a democracy. Those are incredible rights, born out of the 18th century Enlightenment. But our job here is to work all that out between each other. In law, in courts, in schools, over issues of free speech, about foreign wars, or free speech about whose voice will be heard today and whose might not. Americans work out or don't work out, fight over equality between themselves every day. That's why we have courts. Stay out of court if you can. It's not a pleasant place to be if you're on the wrong side of the table. I've only been there for traffic problems. I once forgot to register my car in Massachusetts. I got pulled over and they impounded it. They picked me up with a wrecker and dropped me off at a motel. Said, bye. A month later, I had to go to a courthouse up in a small town in Massachusetts and say, please, I didn't mean to. Pay the court fees and get out of here. You know, I got lucky. Actually, it was stupid, though. It happened to me twice. Anyway, don't go to court if you can help it, unless you're on the right side of the table. But think of Baldwin's idea now. Your response, what does it mean to be a citizen? You hear this all the time, don't you? Oh, be a good citizen. Yeah, and that might mean pick up the trash. It might mean, I don't know, be nice to your neighbor. But it's a lot more than that, folks. It's a lot more than that. You know what? Everywhere you go now, well, everywhere I go anyway, everybody is talking about and having forums on democracy. You may have noticed this. I've been at least, I don't know, 6 democracy forums in the last 6 months. Most places are calling them democracy forums because of the fear that the United States, given the divisions in our politics, which is putting it nicely, that have emerged over the past decade, let's predate this before Mr. Trump, but exacerbated by Mr. Trump and his legions, this thing you call the United States, we call this country, this republic, this system of laws, this Constitution, this society living under a system of laws, it's in trouble. And what actually does democracy mean? This is where citizenship comes about. What does democracy actually mean? Somebody shout out, anybody, 2 or 3. You're able to vote, you have a voice, what else? Democracy, what does it mean? All sides get to choose on a single question.
Yes.
And all sides probably can't win.
Power to the people.
Say what? Power to the people? Why not? Yes, it does. It means citizens have power in your vote, in your representation, in your activity, in your organization, in your activism. What is there anything else democracy means? Equality, you hope. In modern democracies, it's supposed to mean equality. Let's stop on equality for a moment. Think of that word. We use it all the time. I don't feel equal on that. She's more equal than he is, or something. Think about the term equality in historical terms. Yes, sir.
True equality won't be able to exist, am I not wrong?
Say it again.
True equality, like actual true equality
Yeah.
can't exist.
Yeah, that's probably right. And why?
Yeah.
Because we're human beings?
It's like physically not everyone can be equal, as in like height, that kind of stuff.
True. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect equality.
Perfect equality can't exist. There's also social equality too.
Uh-huh.
Actually, social equality can exist, but economical equality is what I'm trying to say.
Economic equality. All right. Perfect. The young man said, in effect, you said, correct me, perfect equality, true equality is not really possible. We're not all the same. Some people can dunk and some can't.
Yeah, exactly.
Some people can dribble behind their back really well and some can't. Some can read a lot faster than others. I wish I read faster. I'm in a reading profession and I don't read fast enough. I want more equality in my reading ability. Come on, God, you blew it. all kinds of physical skills, capacities, and so on, so on, so on. No question about that. But in the realm that's not merely physical, think of it this way. The world lived for centuries and centuries and centuries. And you can be, shall I say, darn glad, especially women, that you're in this 21st century. Because women's equality is pretty new. In historical time, it's brand new. Being a woman in ancient Troy, not a path you might choose. You might end up like Hecuba in Euripides' The Trojan War, screaming in the ruins because all of her sons have been killed and she is about to be marched onto a slave ship. You don't want to be Hecuba. All right, but in the 18th century in particular, humankind, out of the age of revolution and the age of the Enlightenment, began to think seriously. And they had philosophers writing about this for 2 or 3 generations. And some of them were inspired by even much older texts like the epistles of Paul and other parts of the Bible and other texts. But they were now beginning to really talk about the possibility, the probability, the what if human beings could actually find forms of equality. But they understood it as equality before nature and God. Well, you know, you're born as a human being, you have certain claims to being treated like a human being. All right? Natural equality, which is in that realm of high ideas. Before, this is Baldwin's point again, before God and nature. Then in the 19th century, and nowhere quite like in the 14th Amendment in the United States of America, humankind began to talk about equality before the law. Now that's a huge change. You and I are no longer just equal before God, and please God, make it happen. And you might hope he responds by Wednesday or Monday or something. But equality before the law was a revolution. We can actually write laws that make us equal in terms of basic liberties, not our ability to dunk or run fast or whatever. It's only in the 20th century, which you didn't have to live in, that Americans in particular, and other places in the world too, began to talk about a different kind of equality. They tended to call it equality of opportunity. Starting lines. What if equality now can be reinforced, as it has been at least in this country? You can date it a lot of places, but especially since the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s, equality of opportunity, meaning we try to enact law or practices or even traditions that make the starting line in life a little more equal. And here you think of affirmative action programs, all kinds of scholarship programs, fellowship programs, all kinds of elements of, well, what the Europeans call social welfare. Americans are afraid of the word welfare, so we try not to use it. But think where the world has come. Equality before nature and God, 17th, 18th century. 19th century, equality before the law, because they destroyed slavery. And in the 20th century, under a whole set of different historical conditions, they came up with equality of opportunity. But you already went, there's even a fourth one now. And we fight about this all the time. Even when we don't know we're fighting about it, we're fighting about it. And that's what we tend to call equality of economic opportunity. Sometimes even without the word opportunity, it's just, is economic equality a right? Somebody said no. Who would say yes? How about a right to a job? How about a right to health care? Anybody for that? Uh-huh. You're for health care? Yeah, you will be. Economic equality. How about access to decent housing? Is that a right?
It's not a right.
It's not a right. Anybody going to respond to these negative votes over here? Come on, folks. No, yay. That's not helpful. That means you're, yeah, good luck. That means you're going to become a historian, because we always say on the one hand, on the other hand. But seriously, think about it now. What in your economic lives would you consider to be a right? Yes? Education. A right to an education? Hey, it's not that far back in the past when almost nobody really believed that. When education was nothing but a privilege. Here's a thought for you. In this country, we created something called the public school. You go to a public school. I'm serious now. I went to public schools. I don't have an education without public schools. Flint, Michigan's public schools, and 2 Big Ten universities, Michigan State and Wisconsin. I always root for Sparty. But without public schools and public universities, I don't have an education. I get to teach in these fancy, elite, private places, but that's just because of the luck of the job market. But the most democratic institution the United States ever created has equalized us perhaps more than any other institution is the public school. 85% of all Americans in any kind of higher education, from community colleges to the Yales and Harvards and Princetons, 85% are in a public university, college of some kind. And almost 50% of those are in a public community college. Somehow in this country, we've come to embrace education, although we don't have a lot of equality in American education, to put it mildly. If you've got a lot of money, you can go to some very privileged places. If you don't, you better hope you have good academic grades and backgrounds, because they might pay your way. And that's not untrue. I mean, Yale, for one, has enormous financial aid, so get good grades and apply to Yale. Go for it. I have no idea how you get in, though. Don't ask me. I don't even want to know. I don't know how they do it. But, okay, think of the spectrum we've just been through. It's all happened in 3 centuries. 3.5 centuries. Equality before God, equality before law, equality of opportunity, and now we fight over what is economic equality and who gets to decide. How do we make law about that? Because our politics is deeply divided over this. It's only one thing we're deeply divided over. And we don't have a consensus in this country about a lot of forms of access to education, to health care. Why are we still a nation that doesn't give health care to every citizen? Don't answer. But if you do have that one figured out, they're going to pay you a lot of money in some think tank to tell the rest of us how to do that. Now, I'm running out of time, and I'd like to hear some of your questions, but let me leave you with this. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the remaking of the Constitution, the remaking of the American Republic, was a new country, often now called the Second Founding. But during Reconstruction, which may be where you're going next in your course, I don't know, during Reconstruction, this revolution was kind of laid in uneasy ground, even sinking sand, because the whole of society was not convinced that the United States ought to become a truly equal society, racially equal society. The Reconstruction regimes put in place in the South under this 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, trying to federalize the Bill of Rights, what a dream, was within about 6 to 8 years defeated by the counter-revolution of the white South, trying to take, and succeeding in taking back control of its society, its race relations, and its law. Revolutions happen. But history tells us all the time they can also go backward. And a last thought. Pay attention, folks. I'm not predicting anything about next year's election or the next 4 years, or I'm not predicting anything for sure about whether we're on the brink of some kind of new civil conflict, although the press always wants to ask this. I've done at least 2 debates on, I don't know, podcast or whatever they're now called, where we had to draw straws and square off. I squared off with a colleague of mine in the law school at Yale, and the question simply was, is the United States on the brink of a new civil war? And unfortunately, I drew the yes. He drew the no. I think I beat him, but anyway, it was a debate. But let's think for a moment, just a moment. Walk out with this thought in your mind. How many of you are 17 or 18 and vote next year? Any of you? Woo!
17 tomorrow.
All right. Ooh, too late to vote. Hey, all the voters are in the front rows here, have you noticed? They're really keenly interested, and they're all women. Come on, guys. Anyway, think about this. Let's imagine. I'm not trying to, this is not a partisan point, it's just, let's imagine. Donald J. Trump manages next fall a very narrow victory in that ridiculously undemocratic thing called the Electoral College. And try to make your teachers explain why we have an Electoral College. It's very hard. But let's assume that Trump wins Nevada, Arizona, and Wisconsin, and narrowly ekes out an Electoral College victory by 3 or 4, loses the popular vote again, for the 3rd time, by 7, 8, 9 million votes. And a man who's already telling us that he has no intention of presiding over a democracy, becomes the President of the United States and begins his transition and his building of a cabinet. And he's going to be inaugurated in January of 2025. What will Americans do? We don't know. Most of us don't know what we would do ourselves. Will there be a January 6th from the left? Will there be some kind of resistance like the Women's March of 2016, which most of you probably can't remember now? Millions of people in the streets. We don't know. But it would mean that for, is it the 7th out of the last 8 elections, the Democrat wins the popular vote, and in the majority of those elections, the other side becomes president in a system so flawed that it allows this to happen. At what point does your society say, that's not acceptable? I don't know. Most Americans might just suck it up and say, wait another 4 years. Yeah, we'll get them next time, and just hope that, gangster government doesn't truly succeed or whatever. We don't know, but you could be in your lifetime facing, as the 19th century faced, as the people of the Great Depression faced, a kind of new revolution in America that requires you to rethink your Constitution. So you should know it. Carry it around. Become a Khizr Khan. Recite Section 1 of the 14th Amendment like it's a secular prayer. Because without it, you don't have an American government. Thank you. Yeah, anybody have a question you want to throw at me? Come on, throw me a curveball. Questions? Oh, I heard one up here.
Stephen's on fire. Stephen, you want to ask or Patrick? Stephen,
Can I get your autograph, mister?
Questions, not demands. Okay, I have a question up here. The question was, and then we'll get to yours too. I think what you said is education really the way? A right. My view? Damn right. Look, you always hear this term American dream, and for so many people it tends to be a bigger house in the burbs, a two-car garage instead of a one-car garage. No, it isn't. The real American dream is the way education can help you find a way to remake your life. I have no education without the good teachers I had in a public school in Flint, Michigan. I taught in that same school system. I went to public universities where the tuition in my that shows you how old I am, the tuition in my freshman year at Michigan State in the late 1960s was $250 a quarter. I mean, yes, education is a right. Question over there? In the red sweatshirt.
Be aware that the seal of literacy is taking place 5th and 6th period today and tomorrow in the TLH. Thank you.
we're good.
You're welcome. Yes, sir. I think you said, is there a way to fix the Electoral College? The proper legal way is we need a constitutional amendment, which takes, of course, 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures. There is no way in God's earth that's going to happen in this historical moment because the Republican Party really needs their small states. And there is no Republican majority in the United States except on Election Day in the Electoral College. Think that through. Now, there are possibilities that states, this is serious, enough states, and it would take 2/3 of the states, in their legislatures decide, and I think one has now, that in the election they will divide their electoral votes by the percentages of the popular vote in their state. In other words, if somebody wins New York, or somebody wins Connecticut by 60-40, 60% of Connecticut's electoral votes go to the victor, 40% to the loser. It means you're going to you're going to divide up the California vote, the New York vote, the Texas vote, the Florida vote, but the popular vote would, short of getting rid of the Electoral College, which is what we should have done approximately 200 years ago, it is at least a way to maximize the significance of the popular. We are the only democracy in the world that doesn't elect our presidents by the popular vote. Try to explain that when you go abroad to people. They don't get it. I see another question up. Back here.
Yes.
If we took today's politics and put it in 1865, would it have passed would we have passed the 14th Amendment?
I'm sorry, say it again? I
A
can't.
little closer.
All right, ready? If we took today's politics and put it in 1865, would we have passed the 14th Amendment?
Great question, and the answer I think is no. Well, because, remember, all right. When the 14th Amendment was passed, 11 southern states were not back into the Union yet. They had not been readmitted to the Union yet. So the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments were passed without the ex-Confederate states in the Union. Now, you could take their side here, and some have, and say that kind of delegitimizes these amendments, but no, it doesn't. They had forfeited their right to participate in this. But today, in our completely divided politics, pretty hard to imagine a fundamental constitutional change of that magnitude in this politics, because nobody's going to get a 60% majority right now anywhere. What that would take, what getting rid of the Electoral College would take, look, you also have a United States Senate that is a hopelessly undemocratic institution. Why does Wyoming have the same representation as California? Because it looked like a good idea in the 1780s. The only way we'll ever see that change, in my view, is if one political party or the other wins a massive majority. And we haven't had that since Lyndon Johnson's 1964 election. Hey, this has been fun. Go read Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. Don't go to sleep tonight until you read it.
So much. Oh my God. Patrick and Steven, come on up.
Sure.
You talk about all these forms of equality, but not equity for some reason.
Equity?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, I mean, equality is giving someone, equally everything, right?
Right.
So people that